oftentimes our friends on the left, they sort of pick up the story if they think that they're political in the 20th century, which is like coming into the movie three quarters finished and you think you understand the plot. Or, as I said in The Nation, the left-leaning weekly, it reminds me of the jurors in the Rodney King trial. Remember, that was the black motorist who...
I've heard it through your work. Yes.
Sorry?
I've heard it a little bit through your work or you speaking about it. I know about it that far.
Yeah, he was beaten and was captured on camera. He was beaten by the LAPD and California Highway Patrol, and the officers were put on trial, and the defense lawyers did not show seamlessly the video. They showed snippets, and the credulous jury then acquitted the officers, and LA went up in flames. One of the largest bouts and episodes of civil unrest. And that's how the historians do. I mean, or the scholars and the analysts do. So they'll look at Virginia and they're shocked.
Yeah.
The Republican won by playing the race card on the bottom of the deck.
Okay, perfect. So let me get the introduction so we can save all this for the interview and get right into it.
Isn't this an interview? I thought this was the interview.
No, I'll say a little hello quickly and then get right into it.
I think this, but...
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Spar&Brawl. I hope you're having a decent day. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Sam. But more importantly, today we have the pleasure of being joined by Professor Gerald Horne. Professor, thank you again for joining us and your time. I don't think Professor Horne needs much introduction. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston, and quite astonishingly, Professor Horne is also the author of over 30 books, with his latest publication being The Dawning of the Apocalypse: The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, which we'll discuss a lot, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. But okay, Professor Horne, before we get into some of our more specific questions, we just wanted to get your thoughts on it, and we just discussed about it a little bit now, but if you could pick that up about what happened in Virginia and New Jersey just last week with the elections.
Well, what I was saying, and I hope that you include my prior remarks about Los Angeles, everything that I said. Otherwise, I can be accused of doing what I'm just accusing these other people of doing, sort of parachuting into the issue without any sort of historical context or any sort of political context and shooting from my hip. So, as I was saying, the Virginia election in particular involved a typical episode of class collaboration, which is the essence of settler colonialism, which is the process by which Virginia was taken from the indigenous inhabitants in the early 1600s. That is to say, the rich and the not so rich of European descent collaborate for mutual benefit and gain. And that's basically what happened in Virginia. That's what happened in the United States in November 2020, when Donald J. Trump almost got 75 million votes. And the sooner we wake up to this kind of reality, the better off we'll be, because you really can't plot a strategy for taking power or even advance if you don't understand the battleground. If you keep assuming, like some sort of mechanical Marxist, that just because these Euro-Americans may be working class and in Western Virginia, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote for the left in a settler colonial regime. Hello, people. That's my take on U.S. elections generally, Virginia in particular.
So what did you make of the whole narrative that came out being around education and that being the main reason, especially in Virginia?
Well, critical race theory. What's interesting, the line initially in the bourgeois press was that critical race theory comes out of law schools, particularly Harvard, and it's not taught in K through 12. But now the conservatives like Bret Stephens of New York said, wait a minute, it may not be taught, but it's infiltrated the classrooms somehow. He didn't explain how. And those of us who follow US politics should not be shocked, since we recognize that if you look over the past decades, there have been all these racist inflected issues like busing, law and order, affirmative action. Now it's critical race theory, which once again comes out of the context of how this country was settled, where you had an enslaved labor force, which even left folks, I'm afraid to say, oftentimes do not look at through the prism of class, even though they purport to be class warriors. They only look at it through the context of, quote, race, unquote, when it's actually both. And therefore, the Black population, which oftentimes votes against the right by a rate of 9-1, is seen as a stumbling block. And therefore, these so-called race issues, which are actually racism issues, somehow worm their way into the political discourse and lead to the election of Donald J. Trump in 2016 and Glenn Youngkin in 2021.
Yes, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah. Do you think if there was a stronger economic offer towards the working class on the table, like by the Democratic Party or by the Green Party or by anyone, they may have not class cooperated, so to speak? They may have voted a different way.
Well, I keep hearing that, but somebody needs to explain why it is that the Black community has no problem. The Black working class has no problem voting against the right 9-1. Our Euro-American working class and middle class, they seem to have a problem. And so we have to keep coming to this issue of, well, if there was a better left alternative, they might vote for it. But then how does that explain in 1991 when 55% of the Euro-American population voted for a Nazi and a Klansman, David Duke, for governor of Louisiana? I guess if the Democrats had been more to the left, instead of voting for a Nazi, they would have voted for the Greens. I mean, this is, come on, people, wake up. I mean, let's have a concrete analysis and stop descending into these fantasies.
So I think I would say, in fact, because we talk about this with Sam all the time, and now I've come to understand that CRT, the way it's being used commonly now, has nothing to do with CRT. And it's kind of just this umbrella term that is used to dismiss anything that you don't like. So they call it wokeness, I guess, awareness around new racial issues or things like that. And I guess that justifies or supports very well your thesis of this being a cross-class collaboration and settler colonialism.
Well, it's interesting. People don't know the history of this country. I'm writing a book on Texas right now, and the subtitle includes Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And that subtitle is no accident. I mean, in Texas, the settlers basically chose a conscious and intentional policy of, quote, their term, not mine, extermination, unquote, of the indigenous population, particularly the Comanches. And of course, they had slave labor camps as well, involving Africans. But somehow we're supposed to be surprised that in 2021, that you have a right wing that's strong in Texas, that's helping to direct the United States in a more right-wing direction. And it's not like Texas is sui generis. You have a scholar at UCLA, Benjamin Matley, that wrote a book on the genocide of indigenous populations in California. So, as I said, people parachute into the 20th century and start barking out orders about, voting for the Greens, voting for the left, and then totally ignore that the country was based upon slavery and genocide. Mm-hmm. I mean, don't you think that's a relevant factor to include when you're trying to do a contemporary political analysis? No wonder we're in so much trouble.
Okay, so I think maybe your next question maybe touches on some of the things we've spoken about, but maybe if there's some other things that you want to bring up, which is, so what are some issues, historical events, occurrences, and dynamics that we forget to take into consideration when we discuss contemporary issues in the US? I feel like it kind of comes back to what you've been saying. I don't know, do you want to add something, Sam?
Well, it's so much. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you parachute into the 20th century, which is what our friends like to do. I mean, somebody explain, why is it that major beneficiaries, quote unquote, of the last 300 years, speaking of Great Britain and the United States, all of a sudden are turning so sharply to the right and trying to bring the rest of the world with them, with this chauvinism in London embodied in Brexit and propelled by anti-immigrant sentiment, the anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States of America. Why is it that Britain and the United States have a weaker left than France, Germany, Japan, for example, its supposed peers? You would think that that would occur. Or even what I've used in some of my books, look at Canada. I mean, Canada was under British rule and it didn't revolt against London, and they're still the queen on the currency. And yet they have a single payer healthcare system, which our friends on the left tell us is the gold standard to which we should aspire. They have a third party, the New Democratic Party, which provides an alternative to the bourgeois parties, to the so-called Tories and Justin Trudeau and his liberals. So you would think that that would cause people on the left to rethink history, since Canada was a British colony, what is now the United States was a British colony. The United States revolted and set up this so-called revolutionary republic that then proceeded towards ousting Britain from captaining the African slave trade and went like a lawnmower across the rest of North America, mowing down indigenous populations to the point where we are now. But yet, I recall, it's not funny, even though I'm laughing. I recall when the socialist camp was decomposing about 30 years ago, our friends on the left were saying, well, part of the lesson is the United States has these strong democratic traditions. I was saying, democratic traditions? What are these people talking about? I mean, Black people didn't get the right to vote basically to 1965, and now it's being rolled back from that. So basically, they're celebrating apartheid traditions. These are people on the left celebrating apartheid and then wondering why the right wing is on the march.
Sam, do you have something you want to say? Yeah, go ahead.
No, just want to ask, why do you think there is that problem? I find it in every country or every nation that you have left-wing people that when it comes to their own nation's history, it's just completely, they're blindsided, or they have excuses to justify certain like gruesome acts or gruesome things, whether it's the British Empire or the Iranian Empire or the American Empire.
Well, I think in the United States that the propaganda, I'm going to first give some explanations that your audience might consider to be inadequate, but I'll offer them anyway. I think in the United States that the propaganda has been so strong, but then also I think we have to face the facts that many Europeans crossing the Atlantic were able to escape the barbarism of Europe by coming to North America. However, they were not able to see that they were able to escape the barbarism of Europe and entered another kind of barbarism involving genocide against Native Americans and mass enslavement of Africans. Now, if a liberal makes that sort of mistake, I sort of understand it because you don't expect that much of liberals. But why would a person who calls himself a leftist or a radical or a Marxist makes that sort of mistake? It just boggles the imagination. And I think that it's a certain kind of opportunism as well, a certain kind of moral blindness as well. But the problem now is that things are coming to a head. The right wing is on the march. They're not going to take any prisoners. And so now we're all in jeopardy.
Okay, Sam, if you don't have something to follow up there, I wanted to move to, so I believe it's your latest book, which is about the 16th and 17th century. And I was listening to this interview that you did recently, and you were talking about how the 16th and 17th century is usually overlooked. Historians focus on like particular areas of history during a period of time. So what is it, especially in the 16th and 17th century, that you think is very important for understanding American history?
Well, the fundamental question is, why are we sitting here in North America speaking English? When post-1492, Spain had the first mover's advantage. After all, they're the ones who sponsored the freebooter Christopher Columbus. And in order to understand how London or England this minor archipelago on the fringes of Europe was able to advance in the 1500s, you have to understand some sort of history. For example, you have to understand the Protestant Reformation, so-called, with Martin Luther seceding from the Catholic Church, and how King Henry VIII in the 1530s accedes to that particular sect, supposedly because the Catholics didn't want to give him his divorces. But of course, the hidden agenda, not so hidden agenda, was scooping up Catholic wealth in his kingdom, which then helps a takeoff for England, and then cutting a deal with the Ottoman Turks, the so-called Muslim power, which was often at sword's point with the so-called Catholic powers, speaking of what we would call Spain in particular. And often in my book on the 16th century, I draw an analogy between what happened in the 20th century. That is to say that a turning point in world history that is going to resonate throughout this century was what happened in the 1970s, when Nixon goes to China, cuts a deal with Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party, and on an anti-Soviet basis. So just as the English or King Henry VIII, they break from the Christians to make a deal with the Muslims, you have China, the Chinese Communist Party, it breaks with the socialist camp and makes a deal with the capitalists. Now, yay, I'm not hating on China like so many people today. You know, they got a good deal. You had physical manufacturing plants migrating across the Pacific, helping to create this juggernaut in Asia, which now bids fair to leave US imperialism in the dust with gargantuan consequences for the world. I just ordered this book by the so-called defense intellectual Elbridge Colby, The Strategy of Denial, which is really about war fighting against China, believe it or not. And of course, I'm sure you believe it because of the Woodward Costa book, Peril, suggested just 9 months ago, on the eve of leaving office, Donald J. Trump was threatening to attack China militarily so he could declare a state of emergency and remain in power. What's interesting as well is that, once again, our friends in the US left. I happened to be alive during the Cold War, and I was witnessing it up close. And younger generations may be shocked and surprised to find out how so many people in the US left did not oppose the Cold War. They opposed it at the edges. You know, they opposed the war in Vietnam. And hell, at the end, even the U.S. ruling class opposed the war in Vietnam. So that's no big deal. And I'm about to read this other book by John Pomfret, the former Pomfret, the former Washington Post reporter, From Warsaw with Love. And it's about how today Poland is like the 51st state. I mean, that's where many of the so-called prisoners from Guantanamo and elsewhere were sent on rendition to be tortured. And so I recall during the Cold War, all these people on the left were doing cheerleaders for these people to come to power in Poland. Now they don't have a word to say. I doubt if they even know what's going on. I mean, no wonder we're in trouble. These people, they don't keep up. They don't keep up with what's going on. And so they should turn to selling insurance or selling used cars if they can find them. But certainly they should abandon politics.
Yes, I think I might be one of them because I learned quite a few new facts right here during this this response. Yeah, Sam, I don't know if you had anything. If not, I want to move on to the 18th century. But yeah, go ahead.
Just because we spoke about your recent book, I was just reading it, and it's a great book, by the way, fantastic book. I highly recommend it to everyone. I was just wondering, you do a great job of doing a historical analysis of explaining how racism works its way through Europe, from like it's Protestant against Catholics, and then the Jewish people are marginalized, and then it moves to like North Africa with the Berbers and all that. So I was just wondering, do you think out of that, and if you like, would you like to expand a bit, because I'm sure I did a terrible job of summarizing it. So
no, that was good. That was good. I mean, so basically, what happens is that the Spanish, who have a first mover's advantage, as I've often said, I think they take religion too seriously. Insofar as you could be an African in Cuba in the 1500s, and you could be a conquistador, a conqueror, if you profess Catholicism. Mm-hmm. And they also unleash the Inquisition of forcing the Muslim population, the Jewish population. Of course, the Muslims or certain Muslim forces have been ruling a good deal of what is now the Iberian Peninsula for 700 years, up until 1492. And then when the Christians surged back into power, they imposed the Inquisition. You know, you had to become Catholic or die, or at best be tortured. And of course, you have an abandonment of the Iberian Peninsula, particularly by the Sephardim, the Jewish population. But the Protestants, who were the scrapping underdogs, speaking of London, and also the Netherlands too, which of course had been taken over by the Spanish for a good deal of the 1500s. These were, quote, sects, unquote. They needed every warm body they could muster, particularly if they wanted to compete with Catholic Spain. And so they moved from religion as an axis of society to, quote, race. And what this allows them to do, it allows the English to co-opt those with whom they had been warring, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh. Interestingly enough, as I pointed out in my 1776 book, as the British Empire decomposes, you see the Scots as today saying, wait a minute, you know, what kind of deal do we have with London? It's time for us to secede, become independent. We can get a better deal with Brussels, with the European Union, than with London. And so likewise, you see England, which had expelled this Jewish population in the 13th century. By the 1500s, of course, they have a change of mind because they're under the gun. And so they welcome the Jewish population. Now, of course, these scholars with their heads in the clouds, and then they start to prattle and prate about enlightenment. They saw the light, but actually they needed warm bodies to confront these indigenous people and enslave the Africans. And so that leads those who have been warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian, Serb versus Croat. I mean, the list is endless. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, they become, quote, white, unquote. Mm-hmm. And then the same people today who like to use this term identity politics to describe what's happening in my community, they have nothing to say about the identity politics of, quote, whiteness, unquote. They don't even, I doubt they even know it exists. I mean, which is crazy. This is lunacy. But to expand it further, to an extent, this whiteness is a product of pan-Europeanism. As I said in The Nation, the left-leaning weekly, the United States, in many ways, no insult to the European Union intended, but it was like a bloodier version of the European Union, the settler colonial project. You had all these people from Europe, but they had a more coercive regime. That's why no insult intended to Brussels. I might have to cut a deal with Brussels. But it's bigger than that, because you can be Lebanese Christian and be defined as white. Look at Ralph Nader. You could be Iranian Jewish, like some of these people in Beverly Hills. You could be defined as white, unquote. But some of us could never be defined as white. And that becomes like sort of this exploitative axis of society, which should be intuitively obvious to the most casual of observers, but somehow has eluded many of our friends on the left, because even after the Virginia election, they get uncomfortable when you start talking about race and racism, for example, which I don't understand, because, you know, it's there. Why don't you want to talk about it? But to an extreme degree, I do understand it, because if you go back and look at the history of settler colonialism, there's this metaphor that people in the United States use, circling the wagons. You probably heard it before. What that refers to is, you know, is the settlers, as they're invading Native American land, you know, in their wagons with the horses pulling the wagon. You know, the Native Americans attack, right? And so they have to circle the wagons in order to form a defensive perimeter so they could fight back against the Native Americans. And so I think that deeply embedded in the darkest recesses of these people defined as white, unquote, is this idea of being under assault, under attack by angry Native Americans and obstreperous Africans, of which there are many, because these people couldn't help themselves in importing enslaved Africans to North America, even when it was clear that they were just importing more grave diggers, but like a drug addict, hopelessly hooked on the euphoria of profits delivered by free labor. They couldn't help themselves but import more Africans. And so now they have this psychosis of circling the wagons to the point where they can't even talk about like the Virginian election in any sort of concrete manner because it's too fearful. It brings up too many nightmares about being attacked in their beds by angry Africans in the middle of the night, for example, or attacked by Native Americans who they subjected to genocide.
I mean, I really think this Virginia election really is a good example of, like I mentioned, of everything that you've been saying, especially because of the narratives that have come out, right? Initially, there was a narrative, oh, maybe it's backlash because Biden hasn't really done anything, but that doesn't really explain New Jersey either. So people really went around the CRT and education. And when you unpack it, it seems to resonate a lot with what you're saying. I don't know if you agree with what I just said, Sam, if you want to add something. If not, I want to move to the counter-revolution of 1776, which you just mentioned. So could you just basically unpack what are you referring to your book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the U.S., published in 2014?
Well, as I said in the piece in The Nation, which came out a few weeks ago, it's not like reading a book, it's just an article.
Oh, we read it. It's fantastic.
Oh, good. So as I said in that article, even decent historians who look at 1776, and I have in mind the new book by Woody Holton, Liberty is Sweet. It's really a breakthrough in terms of mainstream historians looking at the origins of the United States. But even he starts his story in the middle of the 18th century. My book on 1776 starts with another revolution, the so-called Glorious Revolution in England. After all, this was a colony of the United States. I mean, if you want to understand Puerto Rico, I would hope you would want to understand the United States. And likewise, if you want to understand colonial North America, I hope you want to understand London. And so you have the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, as I mentioned in the piece in The Nation. If you look at some of the new scholarship, like the book by William Pettigrew, one of the motive forces was that the merchant class wanted to elbow its way in to the lucrative nature of the African slave trade. The Royal African Company, started in 1672, was under the thumb of the monarch. So you have the so-called Glorious Revolution, 1688, the clipped the wings of the monarch, leading to today's Queen Elizabeth, who was sort of a figurehead, but actually has more power than is oftentimes revealed. But in any event, it does clip the wings of the monarch in terms of the African slave trade. And so then you have free trade in Africans, as I call it. So the merchant class descend on Africa with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean, which in the 1700s for the longest was seen as more valuable than the North American mainland because of the sugar trade and the fabulous profits that it delivered. But it also delivered slave revolts as well, not only in Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, etc., but also in North America, 1712 New York, 1739 South Carolina. Interestingly, the 1739 revolt was assisted by Africans from Spanish Florida in Spanish military uniforms, sort of a contrast between the two forms of colonialism, for example. One armed in uniforms, the others unarmed, working in the field. Exactly. And so what happens is that for various reasons, England is creeping steadily towards anti-slavery for various reasons. The settlers are creeping steadily in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not only that, but, and here's where most historians agree, even often befuddled bourgeois historians, that when you have the so-called 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which, by the way, leads to the Quebec question, because London ousts France from Canada, leaving these French-speaking people there when it's still a roiling issue in Canadian politics. And London is tired of spending blood and treasure waging war against the indigenous population so that land speculators like George Washington can profit. He's probably the biggest real estate. He's the Donald Trump of his era.
Mm-hmm.
He's a real estate basically.
Even the fake teeth.
Right. From the mouth of an enslaved person, by the way. And
wow.
So London issues the Royal Proclamation of 1763, says you can't move further west across the Appalachians. The settlers led by George Washington are enraged. They want more land so they could bring over more free labor so they can make more money. And that leads to the rupture of 1776. So what happens, of course, is that after they oust London, they oust also London from leading the African slave trade. As early as the 1790s, U.S. nationals are in control of the African slave trade to Cuba, for example. As by the 1840s, they're in control of the African slave trade to Brazil,
Mm-hmm.
for example. Inconvenient facts oftentimes ignored by the myth makers. And so, and of course, they continue moving west, seizing Native American land, particularly, and then Texas becomes like a mini-me of the United States. This is seized from Mexico in 1836, because Mexico in 1829, under a president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, had moved towards abolition of slavery. Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, they were not in favor, to put it mildly. So they waged war against Mexico and then secede, become an independent nation, but then they can't stand up to the pressure from abolitionist London and revolutionary Haiti. And then they enter the Union in 1845. So in sum and in short, that's my telescope version of the origins of the United States in the first few decades of its existence.
So if I understood correctly, kind of the counter-revolution, the term by counter in there, you are referring to the fact that as the UK and England was moving away from slavery because it didn't fit their needs anymore at that time or their interest, the US wants to move towards slavery. So that being, or more towards slavery, accelerate its way. So
absolutely. Absolutely. And then Texas, as I said, is the mini-me. Because as I said, Mexico had moved to abolish slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Under president of African descent, of course, you have to wait until the 21st century to get a president of African descent, meaning Obama. And despite the fact that it's not as if he were ruling from the left, otherwise you wouldn't have this disaster still unfolding in Libya. But still, I think it's fair to say that it freaks out a good deal of the Euro-American population, leading directly to the election of Trump by 2016. Now, of course, our friends on the left, then they start cooking up these figures about how Trump voters were Obama voters, mm-hmm. and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think historians of the future will be seduced by that sleight of hand. And now, of course, they want to cement their victories by keeping a lot of us from voting, particularly Black people from voting in places like Texas. And then, of course, with Texas once again as the model, passing these laws against reproductive freedom for women, which, if they were honest, they would admit that they really just want women to find us white to have more babies. That's really what it comes down to beef up their numbers. And this is the primitivism in which we now find ourselves.
Sam, did you have something? I saw you put your hand up. You wanted to ask something.
No, it
Oh,
got clarified. Yeah,
oh, okay. Okay,
yeah.
so why don't you go ahead with the next question about international solidarity?
Sure. Yeah. You're in your interviews and the few works we read and everything. You're one of the few people that talk about the influence of international factors on domestic or national movements. For example, in 1960s, 50s, civil rights movement, and so on. And then you talk about this deal that was made to get rid of Jim Crow and
Right.
all that. Just want, first of all, if you like, please expand on that. And secondly, why do you think there is not so much left international sort of perspective, whether by Black people in the US or anywhere else? There seems to, everybody on the left seems to be very insulated, especially in the US, from politics or of other nations or international politics in general.
Yeah, and sorry, just to add, and I remember in in a recent interview that you did, you were particularly shocked or kept on using this example about very recently, I believe there was some kind of conference or I
Oh,
forgot
yeah.
exactly what it's called in Africa, I
Mhm.
believe, the union,
Yeah.
and you
Mhm.
said why don't they ever try to form some kind of partnership with these kind of during these times?
Well, I'm referring to what happened in September 2021 when you had a virtual conference between leaders of CARICOM, the Caribbean nations led by
Mm.
Jamaica, Barbados,
Okay, my apologies.
and
Yes.
the African Union, with of course President Ramaphosa of South Africa participating, President Kenyatta of Kenya. Many of the speakers made reference to the Pan African Conference of 1945, which had Black Americans in many ways directing that effort. But yet you have this Pan African meeting in 2021, just a few weeks ago. Most Black Americans, including the leaders, haven't heard about it. Now, I think that it has to do with the Compromise of 1954, whereby the US ruling class, which is competing against the socialist camp for hearts and minds in an emerging Africa and an emerging Caribbean, that find itself handicapped and handcuffed by the existence of Jim Crow, US apartheid. So they make an agonizing retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. But the trade-off is you have to throw the internationalist Blacks overboard, led by the late, great Paul Robeson, for example, the multilingual actor, singer, activist, for example. And since that time, you haven't had that much internationalism expressed at the leadership level of the Black community. Now, of course, there are intermittent episodes. Martin Luther King opposes the Vietnam War, but then he's killed, for example, unsurprisingly. And then, of course, you have the opposite side, where you have the NAACP leaders collaborate with the CIA to try to get leaders of the African National Congress of South Africa to collaborate with US imperialism. That's in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, for example, quoting correspondence from the NAACP collection at the Library of Congress, for example. And so that has led us to the present day dilemma, because now the right wing, they have us where they would like to have us. That is to say, the Euro-American population is generally turned to the right, referencing the Virginia election, and the Black community hardly has any global allies. Although I should say, in fairness, that there have been intermittent efforts to go to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, and of course the UNHRC has been sending delegations to these shores, but it's all very episodic and intermittent. It's not consistent. It's not centrally directed. And that's one of the reasons why the US has turned so much to the right, because there's not as much pressure. There has to be pressure on this country from external forces in order for it to move in a progressive direction. It just can't generate domestically that sort of energy because of this national chauvinism, which invests too much importance in 1776. The blind spots of the US left, who don't like to talk about white supremacy, they don't like to talk about Native American dispossession, except when you thrust it into their face. Otherwise, they prefer to ignore it. And so this is where we are right now.
So once upon a time, there was much more, I guess, internationalism coming out of the US. But I mean, this is just, I guess, for all kind of groups. I mean, US leaders have done just such a good such a good job for them from their point of view of kind of distancing themselves by just funding the UN, but not allowing any of its mechanisms to be used against itself. I mean, I know, for instance, in the US, there's a big problem if you ask some people about migration, and there's an entire organization of the UN dedicated to migration, but they will never speak about the migration, people coming from Mexico, or just kind of touch on that issue. So I mean, they've done such a good job, I feel, to pushing all this kind of UN aside and not really presenting that as a way forward to put pressure. And I was also thinking, does this perhaps have to do, but I guess your example of the past, there being more collaboration like this, and perhaps, I don't know, the Black Panthers, perhaps they saw themselves more as internationalism. But specifically speaking of leftist African Americans, could this perhaps have to do with the fact of not seeking international collaboration, with the fact that slavery in the US intentionally wanted to, you know, cut off the roots of where people would come from? So maybe, I don't know, maybe African Americans in the US would have less, they would see themselves less connected to other parts of the world, or if there is such a conference like you mentioned to take part in.
That's a fair point. The problem is, and I wrote an article about this in the current issue of the academic journal, Diplomatic History. The article is entitled, Her Majesty's African American Allies. That is to say, just like you had a Red Scare in the 20th century, where anybody opposed to Jim Crow was said to be a communist. Mm-hmm. Even if you were Black and didn't like Jim Crow, you were a communist, which meant that you could be persecuted, pulverized, punished. In the 19th century, during slavery, if you were pro-abolition of slavery, that meant that you were dupe of London. Mm. And of course, after London is kicked out of what is now the United States, as I pointed out in the nation, it lost one of its major markets for enslaved property, which is North America, which helps to propel London towards abolition. And then, of course, it has blowing hot and heavy down their necks, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which then began to jeopardize Jamaica and Barbados, their major cash cows, which then pushes them towards abolition too. And so you had Black leaders like Frederick Douglass, even though you couldn't obviously fly, he was on ships all the time to the British Isles, which is what I talk about in that essay. And even after the US Civil War ends in 1865, where you have a diminishing of internationalism, because you oftentimes have these false dawns in the United States. That is to say, after slavery is abolished, 1865, people feel, oh, you know, there's going to be gigantic steps forward. But of course, the Reconstruction period is strangled and drowned in blood, leading to the era of lynching. But then by the 1890s, you have the anti-lynching crusader, Ida B. Wells Barnett. She's on her way to London to campaign. And then that also has impact in terms of putting international pressure on the United States. And then, of course, after the Russian Revolution, you have many Black Americans, Euro Americans, many people in this country, they're turned towards socialism. Mm. And that too is an international movement that's putting pressure on US imperialism. But then, as I said, you get the Compromise of 1954, where there's a retreat from Jim Crow to sort of a palliative to the Black masses, the Black working class and Black middle class, in particular their leaders. But then the trade-off is you're throwing the internationalists overboard. That's where we are today, for example. And the question is, will we be able to make a recovery in 2021, 2022? That's really the question.
Just a follow-up, I want to ask, do you think the rise of China, as some would describe it, or international community, or the decline of US power will allow more opportunities for pressures like this? Or would that even be a positive thing? Because Chinese Communist Party has, some argued, moved towards a more nationalistic sort of tone and all that. So,
well, I'm glad you raised that question because, oh my God. I mean, if you look on the internet, you'll find I've been writing about China for like 40 years or more. And you'll see a sort of transition. That is to say, after they cut the deal in the 70s with US imperialism, I'm railing against China. I remember writing an article, you might be able to find it online. It's certainly in my papers at the New York Public Library. The title of the article was China, Trojan Horse of US imperialism in Africa. It's about the Angola crisis of 1975, when China joins with US imperialism in apartheid South Africa and some Black Americans in opposing the ultimate victor in the Angolan War, the now still ruling MPLA, backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union. So China carried a lot of water for US imperialism. I mean, that's how they got all these manufacturing plants to move across the Pacific. And then it waged war in Vietnam, 1979. I railed against that too. And as a matter of fact, I was doing more politicking then. And I actually traveled to Vietnam. I was in Vietnam right after, I was actually in Vietnam and Cambodia. Oh, wow. Just after the Vietnamese had overthrown the Khmer Rouge, the genocidal maniacs who ruled in Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. And then Vietnamese helped to overthrow them. China objected. They waged war in Vietnam. The United States imperialism was cheering. Now, look, as I said, I'm not anti-China. That would be totally retrograde and backwards. However, as a historian, I feel it's important to talk about what happened, how we got to this point. Okay, so now China and the United States, love has gone bad. I mean, it reminds me of the romantic partners. And one partner says, I'm dumping you. Mm-hmm. The other partner says, you can't dump me, I'm dumping you. And so US imperialism says, we're decoupling from China. That's one of these difficult, bumpy transitions right now with the US economy. That's why you have these supply chain snarls out of the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles, which is really a political economy snarl. And so China says, okay, fine. We're going to dump you. And let's see how you like it when you don't have all those goods in Walmart and Kmart and Target. All right. And so, or it's like the worker comes into work and the boss says, you're fired. The worker says, you can't fire me because I'm quitting.
Yeah.
So, okay, so fine. And now we have this new Cold War. I think I mentioned the Eldridge Colby book. Oh my God. These people are seriously talking about waging war on China nowadays. That's why we have to be very careful to not feed into this anti-China rhetoric. As I say, I even get nervous talking about the history. Wow. Because I feel like I might be unintentionally helping to gin up
demonize
hysteria. Sorry?
Demonize like China unwillingly.
I don't want to unintentionally see. I have on the one hand, I want to tell people what happened. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I don't want to unintentionally whip up this anti-China hysteria because people will take you out of context. I mean, for example, so I wrote this book. So I write a lot about the Black nationalists too. And so during the 1940s, the Black nationalists, they were all into Japan. In November 1942, many of the Black nationalists, they were in uniform and armed, ready to welcome a Japanese invasion of the United States of America. But of course, what happens is they're all arrested and detained for the bulk of the war, including the patron saint of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. And so I wrote this book all about the nationalists in Japan. And lo and behold, the nationalists in Japan translate the work into Japanese as a sort of justification and rationale for their marauding throughout China and Korea, for example. But so on the one hand, I wanted to talk about what happened, but on the other hand, I don't want to be an unwitting tool for certain forces. I mean, it's really a dilemma, I have to confess. But in any case, this relationship between China and the United States, part of what it's going to turn on. Oh, here's something to watch for. You heard it here first. So, believe it or not, the U.S. ruling class is really split on the Russia question. One wing of the U.S. ruling class wants to overthrow Putin so they can better confront China. That's why Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin was just in Ukraine a few days ago. That's why the United States is beefing up its Navy in the Black Sea, for example. Another wing of the U.S. ruling class feels that you can't overthrow Putin. You have to sort of woo Moscow away from China. It's all about China. I mean, this whole Russia game. And so naturally, the Biden administration, they can't make a decision. So they're pursuing both paths. You know, they send Lloyd Austin to Ukraine. They send William Burns, the head of the CIA, and Victoria Nuland, the hawkish State Department leader, to Moscow to try to cut a deal. Then, of course, the so-called free and independent press, they then join in. The Economist, the right-wing publication out of London, which is really sort of a U.S. right-wing publication, even though it's published in London.
I didn't even know it was published in London. Yeah, you're totally right.
Yeah. So they have an article a week or so ago, believe it or not, singing the praises of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. I couldn't believe it. But I think it's because they're part of the wing. They want to help to destabilize Putin
more.
And they feel they're pumping up.
They are right now. They're the Right now, the Communist Party is the tactical ally against Putin because they're the second biggest party, I think.
Right. So, New York Times. Look at New York Times today. They have an article trumpeting praise about these magnificent subway stations in Moscow and how beautiful they are from the Soviet era. I mean, I thought you weren't supposed to say anything. I thought you weren't supposed to say anything good about the Soviet era. I thought it was all a disaster and a catastrophe. And as a matter of fact, just as a footnote, I think this is what's led to what these people don't like, critical race theory, because people begin to say, oh, okay, you can't say anything good about the Soviet Union, the socialist camp, even though they helped to fund liberation wars in Africa, but you can't say anything good about it. You always have to say it was a disaster. It was a catastrophe. And if you disagree, you're morally repugnant. Okay, fine. That's the standard. Let's look at the United States. Let's look at slavery and genocide and, look at it through that lens. But in any case, watch U.S. policy towards Russia, because right now it's incoherent and schizophrenic. They're pursuing two different lines, trying to ride two horses going in different directions at the same time. Something is going to have to give. It's going to be very difficult, however, to beat back a century of Moscow bashing, which has been in existence except between 1941 and 1945, when the United States and Soviet Union were in alliance against Germany and Japan. And then if you go back and look at the movies, all of a sudden you get these pro-Soviet movies, like Mission to Moscow, for example, which you can find on YouTube. And then, of course, after World War II ends, then they persecute all the filmmakers who made those movies. it would be as if, after the United States decides to intervene in Afghanistan under Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, all of a sudden you have these Rambo movies about
Mujahideen,
the freedom fighters. You have Charlie Wilson's War. Which praise them as
one of the James Bond movies.
Yeah, the James Bond. All these, singing the praises of people they now call terrorists, for example. So the only thing that's not surprising, they haven't called all these filmmakers into Congress like they called the filmmakers into Congress in 1946, 1947, and put some of them in jail. They should put I wonder why they haven't thought about putting Sylvester Stallone in jail for making that Rambo movie that sings the praises of Osama bin Laden.
Go ahead, Sam.
Sorry, just I'm gonna skip one question ahead, just because you mentioned that you don't like your work to be, used unintentionally for other purposes. We also had this question that because you talk about the importance of learning actual history. Do you think there is such a thing as, first of all, why do you think that is? Secondly, do you think how much can we actually get to objective history? And I was mostly thinking of E.H. Carr's work, What is History? I don't know if you like this, because he's one of my favorite writers as well. And I just thought, what is your view on history as an academic topic?
Well, it's hard, just as I just described. First of all, I'm sure you know, with regard to history, certain facts do not change. 1776, there is a revolt against British rule in North America. The question becomes, why did they revolt, for example? And that's where you have the contestation, for example. China and the United States get in bed together in 1971, 1972, that's a fact. Now, the question is, why did they get in bed together? Now, in my journalistic writing in the 1970s, I stressed quite a bit the anti-Sovietism that drove that decision. Future historians may look at it different. Future historians might be more sympathetic to China. For example, you see this with mainstream historians today. They talk about a so-called nuclear threat that China faced from Moscow that forced them in that direction. You won't find that in my work, for example. So, there's a saying amongst certain historians that history is argument without end. And I think that's the case, because oftentimes when we're writing history, we oftentimes have our eye on the present, for example, which I think is unavoidable and understandable. Some of these historians today, they try to throw you a curveball. As I've said in a number of different places, they're akin to a doctor. You go to the doctor, something is wrong with you. The doctor wants to take a medical history because they feel that if they can find out how your parents fared and how your grandparents fared and how your great-grandparents fared, they might be able to have insight into how you're going to fare. But with these bourgeois historians, many of them are proud of being ignorant of the present, which allows them to sort of repeat whatever nonsense that they're told. And so they're like the doctor who says, well, I'm taking your medical history, but I'm only taking it not because I'm trying to make you well, not because I'm trying to make the body politic well, as a historian might say. I'm just doing it just for whatever reason, history for history's sake. No eye on trying to make a better world or to change things for the better, which basically comes down to, I'm just taking this history because I'm trying to perpetuate the status quo. And that's where so many historians are today. They're really, whether they know it or not, just really perpetuating the status quo, which is one of the many reasons we're in so much problems, so many problems nowadays. But I see that it's 12:01.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So you can ask, if you want to wrap up.
Would you have time for one more question? There's one I really wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
And I've actually heard you talk about this before, but I think for others it'll be interesting. So I heard you talk about this with Paul Jay in The Real News, I think maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and it was about your book, The Deepest South, the United States, Brazil, and the African slave trade. So I found it fascinating when you talked about the difference of slavery in Brazil compared to the US. And even though Brazil, I believe, abolished slavery later than the US. So if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, United States in 1865. Portugal, which, as you know, today has a contemporary population of about 10 million, had this gigantic empire based upon its first mover's advantage post 1492. Of course, it was part of the Spanish Empire from about 1580 to 1640. And so it not only controlled Brazil, but Mozambique, Angola, East Timor, Macau, part of the People's Republic of China now, and various other sites, Guinea-Bissau, for example.
Southern Iran.
Sorry?
Southern Iran.
Really? Southern Iran?
Or more.
Yeah, what time period?
15th century, I think 15th.
Oh, okay. I know it's southern India for sure. You know, I mean, Dinesh D'Souza, the right wing,
Yes.
right winger from the United States. Of course, he has this Portuguese name based upon Portuguese colonialism in South Asia. But in any case, so Brazil has this small population, and it's trying to tame this huge empire, not only in Africa and elsewhere, but Brazil. And so almost by necessity, and also they're Catholic. I'm not a religious bigot, it's just a fact. And so unlike the Protestants in North America who moved towards the whiteness project, which allows them to broaden the base of settlers, and that's how they defeated the Native Americans in Texas, for example, because you could be German, you could be Swiss, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, whatever. You're white, and therefore you can fight the Indians. So the Portuguese then basically allowed or facilitated the growth of a class of individuals in Brazil who were partially Black, but were free. They had a larger free Negro population, what we would call a free Negro population. And you had a similar process in Cuba, which is also part of this, also Catholic. And so, as I point out in the book, you not only had this so-called large free Negro population, but then, of course, the Yankees were bringing in boatloads of Africans on a steady basis in collaboration with the Portuguese, particularly from Angola and particularly from Mozambique. But what happens with the end of the US Civil War and the abolition of slavery in North America, that's a blow to slavery in the hemisphere. Although it takes 23 more years for slavery to be abolished in Brazil. Interestingly enough, as I also say in that book, The Deepest South, you had the migration of many slave owners with their Africans in tow to Brazil.
Oh, wow.
And their descendants are still in Brazil. I wrote a book too called The White Pacific, US Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas after the Civil War. Also after the Civil War, you had these Euro-Americans who went to the South Seas to enslave Melanesians and Polynesians in Fiji and in Queensland, Australia. What happens in Fiji in particular, it's very interesting. What happens is that the indigenous Fijians in some ways decide to collaborate with London because they're so frightened of the Yankees. One of the reasons why Fiji becomes a British colony. But then when you collaborate with London, that opens the door for South Asian migration to Fiji. And then, of course, that leads to the conflict in the late 20th century, 21st century, between the indigenous Fijians and the population of South Asian origin, for example. But what happens in the late 19th century with the Yankees trying to enslave all the Polynesians and Melanesians is that the Kingdom of Hawaii objects. It's a very powerful kingdom. It has diplomatic missions all over the world. It's too is close to London. It has electricity and telephones in some instances before they have it on the North American mainland. And they cut a deal with the rising Japan as a kind of protection against the Yankees. to this very day, the plurality of the population of the Hawaiian archipelago is of Japanese ancestry, for example. But alas, that does not save them. In the 1890s, the Yankees overthrow the kingdom, set up an apartheid regime, which is their tendency. And as I point out in the White Pacific book, this is one of the flashpoints leading to war between the United States and Japan when Japan, of course, attacks Hawaii, December 1941. Now, of course, these US people, they like simple stories. So they want to portray, Tokyo as being the bad guy, the enemy. They don't want you to talk about discrimination against people of Japanese ancestry by the US apartheid regime in Hawaii, because they think it might justify the attack on Pearl Harbor. But people, that's what happened. I mean, these apartheid maniacs, they did discriminate against Japanese people. Now, that doesn't mean you justified the preemptive attack on Pearl Harbor. But, it didn't help bilateral relations. Can we at least say that? So anyway, we could go on, I'm sure, for the rest of the day.
Yes.
But,
no. Thank you very much for your time. So hopefully we can have you again sometime soon in the new year when your new book is out, and maybe talk a bit more specifically about one of your books.
Right on.
And your movie taste, I've read a lot about that. It's fantastic.
Oh, hey, check out Attica. It's on Showtime now. It's very interesting. It's about the largest prison revolt in U.S. history, 1971.
Oh, okay, wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Or a fiction?
No. It's a documentary.
Oh, okay.
They got a lot of footage because the TV cameras were on the scene filming during this prison revolt. It's very interesting.
Wow.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely check it out.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Professor. Again, I look forward to watching myself this interview again to take some of this stuff in. But yes, thank you so much, and hope you have a good day. And please like and subscribe for everybody watching, and we'll see you in our next video. Thank you.
All right, good luck. Bye-bye. Hey, send me the link.